You're listening to episode 321, Weeds and Seeds of Ministry, number 4, which is Center of Attention Snapdragon and Mission Myrtle.
Welcome to Transforming Missions Podcast, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Yeah, we'll say more about the weed and seed for this week in a moment. But first, let's remind listeners what these weeds and seeds are and why we're spending time talking about them.
Sure, the ministry weeds are things that each and every one of us can struggle with as pastors and as leaders. Weeds are things like overwhelm and fear and not having enough time. It could also be something like isolation that can stop us from being and becoming who God created us to be. The weeds tend to choke out our effectiveness as leaders and can quickly take over if we're not careful. Weeds pop up all the time, but as we learn to identify them, we can quickly pluck them up and replace them with a seed. Or focus our attention on the seed.
And the seeds are the solution, the response, or the antithesis of the weed. So the seeds help us continue to lead well and fuel effective ministry. And when we embody practices like equipping others for the work of ministry and building trust, we continue to grow as leaders and serve in ways that honor our calling, that honor God, and honor the people we're leading.
So are we ready for this week's weed?
I love that question. Sure, it's the weed this week is the Center of Attention Snapdragon.
Okay, so say that 10 times fast.
The Center of Attention Snapdragon makes themselves the focus of ministry. This can happen slowly over time when style or preferences or opinions cause conflict to emerge.
And Tim, even hearing you name that, I've heard you say it more times than I care to admit. When a pastor or leader becomes the focus of ministry, you've lost focus. You've lost your focus on the mission.
Since I've said it so many times, I won't say it again. Because the focus of ministry and mission is Jesus. And when anyone or anything replaces Jesus, you're no longer focused on the mission.
So is it fair to say this can happen during a conflict?
I've certainly seen it happen during conflict. And it doesn't have to be a major conflict. Again, it might be a conflict in style, a difference in opinion about preferences for worship. I mean, nobody's ever had an opinion about worship.
Never.
or the way meetings are led. If a conflict emerges and the people involved are unable to just take a moment to pause and ask thoughtful questions of one another, seek to find a solution, someone or something other than Jesus becomes the focus.
And I'm just imagining a snapdragon sitting in the center of the room, and if it could talk, it might say something like, "Here is a reminder of how you're behaving and treating one another. So here's your reminder, love one another as Jesus loved you." Because often when I have been a part of conversations, and usually I've been called in to help navigate when a conflict has happened, there's nothing loving about what is happening. They're not loving one another, and they're not demonstrating the love of God that we know in Jesus.
Exactly. And when it's not the love of God we know in Jesus that's fueling ministry, sometimes this weed becomes defensive. And when there's defensiveness, the mission is no longer being fueled by that love.
Okay, we may have given this weed more airtime than it deserves. When the Center of Attention Snapdragon sprouts, I think we've made our case. People are no longer focused on the mission.
Sarah, I'll have my district superintendent hat on for a moment. That many times when people have difficulty with a pastor, what happens is the mission no longer is the focus, the pastor becomes the focus. Now, I know that many of our listeners are pastors. I just want you to hear this. If you make yourself the center of attention, whether it's because you've got to have your way, or you make yourself the center of attention because you are so good, everybody wants to follow you, you've lost focus of the mission. That's what we're talking about here.
So can I say it plainly? If your ego is too big and all the attention is being called to you and you're not pointing people to Jesus, you're not focused on the mission.
And what I'm learning is that even when there's conflict and it might be focused upon you as the leader, you have, through your own self-awareness, have the opportunity to keep people focused in another direction. You don't have to take it all personally. I know it hurts. I know it feels like you want to tell some people to go straight someplace. But what it comes to is you have the opportunity as the leader, even in your vulnerability, to be who you're supposed to be. And you keep focused upon the mission, the love of God we know in Jesus.
So I keep trying to move us on from center of attention Snapdragon because it feels counterintuitive to talk about it. But I know you need to talk about it to be able to set the stage. So are we ready to move on to the fourth seed? Because I like this one. I like this one partly because of the series of books it calls to mind. Myrtle keeps the mission at the center of ministry. Do you know what book I'm referring to yet? It's not a ministry book at all. There's your hint. They recognize even their good ideas have to be evaluated through the lens of the mission.
Yes, sir. I know we both appreciate this one because its focus is on the mission. And I'm just surprised we've waited until number 4 of weeds and seeds to even name it.
Touché. Maybe we should talk to the people who do this podcast and fix that.
I know them both well. Mission Myrtle asks questions like, why are we engaged in this ministry? Questions like, does it help us focus on the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world?
Yeah. And I am always surprised by the things that can happen in our local churches that people don't understand what is and what isn't focused on the mission, and even have an understanding of why are we doing this thing that takes a ton of energy and takes a ton of effort and might even take a lot of money. And no one's ever stopped to answer the question of why. Why are we engaged in this ministry, let alone connecting it to the mission? And one of the churches that I served, when I arrived, I was handed a list of ministries of the church, and there were well over 100 of them. And I was kind of blown away, thinking, how could a church have over 100 ministries that they are involved in? It was a large congregation, but 100 ministries. I mean, I don't even know some of the largest congregations that I had observed from afar that really had 100 ministries that they could name. And over my time there, it came to the place that we needed to make some decisions about an endowment fund that we had and where that money was going. And so how I approached it was looking at all of these ministries, because I came to find out that those 100 ministries, some of them were claimed as a ministry because someone gave money to that organization or they sat on a board for that organization. They weren't truly things that the church was engaged in ministry with. And so we were able to remove some of those things very quickly. And then it got to the place that there were things that they were definitely good causes, but we began to filter them through the mission and ask the question and make the statement that the money that we are giving is going to follow the mission. And we looked at how could we engage with that ministry to build relationships with people and help people live out their faith in ministry. Now, I would love to tell you that that was a beautiful process and it was an easy process and people loved doing it. Oh, I frustrated more people than I could count by what we did. Because what was heard in the midst of that, and I'm sure that I contributed to this, was what you do isn't important. And that was not at all what we were trying to say. What we were trying to say is, as a congregation, there are certain things that we are going to focus on, and those things that we are going to focus on and where we are going to give our money, where we are going to focus our time, where we are going to put our effort and our energy is going to be aligned with the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Now, part of what I would say to you is when you are focused on the mission, that word focus can frustrate people. And why does it frustrate people? Because all of a sudden, if anything goes, now you have, I'm going to go back to our previous episode, now you have boundaries. Anything doesn't go any longer. And you have to be able to articulate how is something contributing to the mission.
Well said. So let me say it a different way. I'll put a biased point of view to it. It's okay if someone says you're focused to a fault.
Oh, you've never heard that ever.
I've heard that several times over 50 years. You're focused to a fault. It's okay. Because your job is to stay focused on Jesus, and it's to help other people stay focused on Jesus. And the life of the church, the ministry of the church, the mission of the church is an activity. And it's not even saying that we're involved in all of these things. The mission of the church is to experience the love of God in Jesus in the world in which we're living, in and through each other, and interaction with one another. That doesn't happen, if I may say it this way, and I'm not a hunter, I don't know a whole lot about guns, but I will say it this way. It doesn't happen with a shotgun approach. It happens when you are laser focused. Does that mean the things around it aren't important? No. What it means is what you're focused upon. If it's the love of God in Jesus, there will be plenty of love left over for the things around you.
Yeah, and it's also, there have been times, this is a silly example, but it's been said, so I'll offer it. Well, are you saying we can't do potlucks any longer? No. But do the potluck and name it for what it is. It's an opportunity for the church family to sit down and have a meal together and spend some time together. Now, you might be intentional in that, in focusing on the mission, in doing something like that. I've never experienced a potluck that had any intentionality because it's a potluck. The very nature of it, it's not focused on the mission. It's a great example of whatever goes, whatever you want to bring it. And sometimes, I'm sure that you can relate, you've had some really interesting meals at a potluck. Now, the one thing that I will say about this one is I do wish that I didn't have a picture of the actor in Harry Potter. There, I just gave you the name of the book series and the movie that continues to come to mind every time we said or focused on Mission Myrtle. Just Google Moaning Myrtle Harry Potter if you need a little laugh, because that might help you keep your mind focused on and have a little bit of sense of humor about staying focused on the mission. Can we shift a little bit to some of the questions that now I have that actor's face really in my mind, even asking this question. Are we ready to shift to some questions that Mission Myrtle might offer in the midst of
I'm
conversation?
ready.
Okay. So if you've been in a meeting with Mission Myrtle, you may have been asked a question something like, where have you seen God at work? Now, you might say, well, how does that question relate to the mission? That question helps people keep their eyes and their heart open to Jesus. It's a question that is asked every time there's a meeting to help people be able to articulate their faith, remind one another of God's movement in their midst, and to stay focused on the mission. So let me just try this. Tim, where have you seen God at work?
Sarah, I pray every day. This is just my confession. I pray every day that God would help me see Jesus in the people that I encounter, whether it's just an acquaintance or a relationship. I think that's one way that, as we've talked in previous episodes, it's one way that helps me with generosity, because I'm looking for Jesus. Some easy places to do that. I know you asked me a specific question. I'll get there. But an easy place to do this is with children. Because I think for us, children are less intimidating because they're children. It's a little more difficult to see Jesus in some people, might be adults, who are saying and acting differently than we want them to. It's easy to say for me, oh, I saw God in an eclipse. It's easy for me to say that I can experience God's power through the storms that have come through our area in recent weeks. I can say that. But I think the mission isn't just me trying to find a place where I see God in work in nature or in the universe. I think the mission is to see God or experience Jesus or God's love in people. And somehow, I'm not sure when I made the specific decision, but somewhere I decided that I would experience Jesus every day in the people around me. Sometimes I do that, and I don't want to go for a long time here, but sometimes I can do that through colleagues sitting around a table. When I just experience some of the things that they've experienced. One of my colleagues had a child with disabilities, and he's been able to tell stories about how he grew being able to be an advocate for his son when he found out that even he was standing in the way of his son at times when other people were wanting to love him. And I'm saying to myself, my goodness, how many times do I stand in the way of love of Jesus because I want to be loved a certain way? I have experienced God's love even in the midst of some real conflict, like we talked about last week. And one situation particularly was somebody I have great respect for, who sees things differently than I do. And I keep saying, God, show up in his life so what we say and do brings you glory. But saying all that, I will say that where I experienced God's love or experienced Jesus one time recently, and this wasn't just yesterday or today, it's when I turned 70. And
Happy birthday, Tim.
Well, it's over. I'm on my way to 71. But when I turned, and thank you for that, I'm watching my son with his daughters, and we're having a celebration. And I know it's my birthday, and we've got a cake, and we've got all the stuff. But I remember particularly a time when it was a difficult time being a father, and I didn't know what to do. I mean, I wasn't doing well. So I just remember one time just saying to God, I don't know that I can do this the way it's supposed to be done. I just need to be the father he needs. And through all the conflict we had at that moment, just with that relationship, I began to see Jesus in him. Even though he wasn't acting the way I wanted him to act, he wasn't doing what I wanted him to do, God started showing up in him. And on this birthday, I experienced Jesus in my granddaughters. I've told several people that that was probably the best birthday I'd ever had. And I have a good friend that continues to remind me of my birthday. And we joke about it because it's fun. But every time I'm reminded that I have the opportunity to see Jesus in the people around me.
Tim just answered the question in multiple ways, and I'm glad that he did, and did it in a way that gave you a few examples of what might happen if you ask that question. Every time I have had conversation with leaders, or even asked that question for the first time myself, often what I get back are blank stares. And so this is a place that you're going to need to go back to last week's seed of trusting time and continue to ask the question. And then when you get to the point where you have multiple preachers in the room and they have multiple examples and they might want to give a sermon, you might have to ask them to bottom line it. So that you're not spending your whole meeting just on that example. I only offer those tactical things because I've seen people ask this question and then they'll say something to me like, well, nobody had a response, so I'm not asking it again. Ask it again. Ask it again. Keep asking it. And you can ask it in different ways. There is not another way that I know that is, well, there's many other ways that you can come around it, but it is a great question to continue keeping people focused on the mission and keeping focused on Jesus.
Yeah, you just a generous way of saying I said too much all at once.
No. Don't twist my words.
So let me give you one that I still laugh about. Just happened the other day, and I don't know why. I don't even remember what I was wearing, but I'm at a grocery store, and somebody walks up to me and says, "Can you tell me what aisle such and such is in?"
Were you in Target and had on a red shirt?
and I immediately, the thought came to mind, I don't work here. But what came out of my mouth was, I know what you're looking for. Let me take you to where it is.
You didn't even say, let me find someone who might be able to help you.
No, I said, because I knew where it was. I said, instead of me pointing to where it was, I said, let me take you to where it is. And we walked a couple aisles down, and there it was on the shelf. And thank you. And I pulled it off the shelf. Is this what you want? I got thanked. And that night, as I reflect every day, I just thought, for the first time in almost 70 years, I actually didn't point a finger and say, you can go that way to do it. I said, come and go with me, and I'll take you to it. And that's what we're really about. The mission at that point isn't trying to point somebody in a direction. It's taking people along with us, joining people on the path, inviting them along in the movement to get to Jesus.
Yeah, your naming Mission Myrtle is a leader who models for others and helps others be intentional. Intentional in their actions, intentional with their time, intentional with their money, intentional with their people resources.
So, Sarah, what I would say is, even using me as that example, and that being focused to a fault might very well be that you're involved in what you're involved in, but the focus is always to help people find their way into God's loving embrace so they can be who God created them to be. I want to say this. I am totally in 100% support of Justice Ministries, But if we forget why we're in justice ministries, we are not about the mission of the church. I'm in 100% of evangelism. But if we forget why we're telling the story, we have lost our focus on the mission. So being focused to a fault means that everything you do grows out of that mission for the purpose of being who God created you to be.
And yes, Tim said everything.
Everything.
Everything. Well, thank you for pulling the weeds for us and planting the seed of Mission Myrtle. Here's something that I learned when I went looking for a picture of a myrtle plant, because I was trying to pull the weed of seeing moaning Myrtle from Harry Potter in my mind. Myrtle roots easily. Our prayer is that that might be so for our mission as well. And even if it's not easy, oh, what God might be able to do with a dose of intentionality. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this fourth installment of the Weeds and Seeds of Ministry. We can't wait to share the next weed and seed with you next week. As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode and maybe even a picture of moaning Myrtle if you go check it out. We'll just have to wait and see. You can find all of that at transformingmission.org/321. And if you missed any of the previous episodes in this series, we'll link to those on the show notes page as well. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.